him, but covering Scotland, and it's lovely to have you all here today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Yeah, and Fiona will be doing the second webinar, so it's nice that you meet her today. And we also got Patrick in the background who's going to be putting in links and doing bits and bobs for the technology as we go along, if that's okay. So that's the session today. We are going to be using the chat quite a lot, so unfortunately I wish we could have you on screen. I wish we could have you off mute, but with this number of people we actually can't. So you're here and we will answer every question that you say in chat. So if there are questions that you want to ask us, please ask away in chat. Patrick will keep an eye on those. He can answer some of them already, but if there's things that you want to ask myself or Matt or Fiona, then please do put them in. Our session will be last 45 minutes, so it finishes at 1:45, which we think is really nice because it'll allow you a little bit of extra time, because I know for some of you this might be your lunch hour, this might be your break time. So I firstly wanted to start with a massive thank you really for your support as employers, for supporting our registrants out there in practice at the moment. It's a massive thank you from us for what you're doing with them, and we hope that these webinars will really support you in your role. So you know, that's what they're actually here for. So a bit of housekeeping. I've talked about chat. I've put in the link to Slido. We're going to use some polling, but I've just found literally 2 minutes before my phone was working, and it's not at the moment, which means I have to navigate the polling through my phone, but it may work. We'll try again in a second. I'm hoping that it will, but we'll actually have a go in a minute and see if we can get some polling to find out what your thoughts are. I've already talked about the session lasting 45 minutes, so I think off we'll go, if that's all right. So before we start, I'm going to plug the other two series of webinars for you. And Patrick, would you kindly pop in chat if you haven't already signed up for these other two webinars in our series? It would be great to see you there. Our second one is next week, actually. And it's on registration. We know that you have quite a lot of responsibilities. Your registrants have a massive amount of responsibilities about their own registration. I'm a nurse by profession and Fiona is a speech and language therapist. We have our own responsibilities for maintaining our own registration. But it's nice to go some of these through with you as employers, some of the things that you can help your registrants with their registration responsibilities. And on the 16th of November, it's myself looking at fitness to practice and some of the statistics that we hold about fitness to practice, but also looking at how you can help your registrants to maintain their own fitness to practice. So that's a little bit about the next sort of few webinars that we're going to be running for you. The next massive favour I have is that we actually write an amazing newsletter called Insight for Employers. The last one came out a couple of days ago, actually a couple of days ago, last week, which was very much focused on supervision. And there's some great articles in it from what I trust in Scotland, sorry, Hospital Board in Scotland, that talks about supervision. So I'm hoping that that will be really useful to you. So if you can click on the link that Patrick's popped in chat, sign up for our employer newsletter. It's not too heavy. We only send you about 3 or 4 times a year our employer newsletter. And if anybody wants to write for our employer newsletter, we'd be very grateful. If you want to email us later, we're really happy to have you write an article for our employer newsletter. If there's something you'd like to celebrate in your own area of practice or your own organisation, we'd be really happy to sort of promote that for you. So that's a little bit about 2 things to ask you to do, if that's all right. So this is what we're going to cover for the next sort of 45 minutes of your time. And again, thank you for giving up your time. We're going to look a little bit about what the Healthcare Professionals Council does and the standards that we write, but really what the new standards of proficiency say. Now, the new standards of proficiency were only actually launched about 2 or 3 months ago. And actually, they're really important for your registrants. So we thought it's important to tell you about them so that you can support your registrants to achieve them. We'll talk a little bit more about those as we go through. So what do they actually say, and how you can support your staff to implement the new standards of proficiency? And really some other support that we have on offer for your registrants. We've run a series of webinars for them. So we'll promote those things as we go through, and I'm hoping that'll be really useful to you. Lovely. So this is where I hope that my phone, which was working literally just before the session, which does not seem to be working now. How very irritating, that's all we can say. But never mind. So I was going to ask you to write in the polling to tell me which profession you manage. But if you could possibly write that in chat, that would be really useful. So in chat, if you could just possibly write what professions you manage, that gives us an idea of who's in the room, really. That's okay with you. Okay, I'm going to skip over the next one. So this is a little bit about what we do at the Health and Care Professionals Council, and this is a bit about the importance of the role with you. Thank you. People are very kindly bearing with my lack of polling ability today and kindly writing in chat the sort of professions they manage, your stars. If I can get it to work later when Matt's talking, then that'll be a bonus for me. But if I can't, then that's just life, isn't it? Technology. So this is what we do at the Health and Care Professionals Council. Our primary aim is related to patient safety, but we're very well aware that in order for your registrants and yourself, some of you will be registrants as well, to maintain or to promote or to ensure patient safety, we need to support you in your role. So this is what we do. We maintain the register of health and care professionals registrants, and we register 15 professional groups, and you can see a list of those on our website. We set standards, and that really is what today is about. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the standards that we set as we go through, so hang on to that thought for a second. We quality assure the education of registrants in the UK or healthcare professionals as they train in the UK, and we respond to fitness to practice concerns. That's our statutory role. But right in the centre, you can see those three things: regulation, learning and preventative action. That's our corporate aims, really. Those are things that we think are really important for us at the HCPC. So you know that I talked about standards. This is probably one of the most important things we actually do at the Health and Care Professionals Council. We write the standards that underpin everything that your registrants do in practice. And the three core pieces of sort of standards and guidance that we write are those three on the screen. And my colleague Matt in the policy team undertakes a regular sort of review of the standards. And as I've said, the standards of proficiency that are highlighted with the arrow right in the middle are the ones that we've just updated a couple of months ago. We're actually also in the cycle of just starting to review our standards of conduct, performance and ethics. And they're going to be, that consultation for those will come out next year. We're doing the pre-consultation webinars for those, but they're going to be reviewed as well. And there's also a document called Continuing Professional Development and Your Registration, which your registrants will also be really interested in reading. So that's the sort of suite, really, of standards and guidance that we actually write about. And Matt, I'm going to hand over to you because I know that you're an expert and you were very heavily involved in writing the new standards of proficiency. And while you're doing that, I'm going to see if I can get my polling app to work. So I'm going to hand over to you, Matt, for a second. Thanks.
Thanks. Hi again, everyone. So we started reviewing our standards of proficiency in 2019. We went out to consultation in 2020, and we were able to get approval from our council in March of this year. So it was a relatively long process of making these changes. We consulted quite widely with education providers, employers, professional bodies, trade unions, to make sure that we were setting the new standards at the threshold necessary for safe and effective practice. And one of the changes that we made in the standards compared to our current standards is to just make a much more clear distinction between our standards which apply to all of our registrants and our standards which are profession specific. Next slide, please. Thanks. So just a quick update on, or refresher on, how the standards of proficiency work. So they're the professional standards that all of our registrants need to be able to meet at the point they join the register. They describe what our professionals need to know and understand and be able to do when they apply to join the register. And they work with some of our other standards, all of our other standards, such as the standards of conduct, performance and ethics, the policies and guidance for employers, professional bodies. But importantly, it's important to think of the standards of proficiency as a foundation rather than a ceiling. So they set the threshold for safe and effective practice. They're not the limit of what people can do. Next, please.
Matt, I'm just going to interrupt 1 second. Do you mind to just try the
Sure.
polling just before we carry on? Would you mind? So just
No,
bear with my technology and just see. Oh, look, it's working. So I'm going to ask you if you could go back. I know kindly working. I know that we asked you to download Slido onto your other browser or onto a mobile phone. And if I could ask you just literally, if you don't mind, to vote, because now it's working, I feel quite chuffed really with myself. So if you could write how you feel at the moment your knowledge related to the new standards proficiency is. It's useful for us to know whether you actually know quite a bit about it or not a lot about it. And then what we'll do, sneakily, we'll ask you at the end and see whether there's any improvements that you've made. And you've kindly got working, and my polling's working as well. So that's quids in, Matt, isn't it, really? So thanks ever so much. I'm going to just leave it for a few more minutes, if that's all right, just to see what people are thinking. There's quite a cross section. We've got a nice sort of standard deviation curve, Matt. Some people feeling that they know a little bit about it. Some people know a little bit more. And I'm sorry to interrupt you, Matt, before you went on to the actual what it said, because you'd be, you know, telling the story about standard proficiency before I'd asked people what they thought. So brilliant. I'm going to go off that, Matt, now, if that's okay. And I'm going to carry on with your slides. So thank you for bearing with me. So over to you, Matt, again. There we go.
Thanks. So why have we just done a review? We review our standards on a rolling basis. The current standards that we've got were actually written in 2013. It takes us a while to update standards. Obviously, we also want them to stick around for a while to give some consistency for education providers. But the standards have to remain fit for purpose. So practice has changed in the last few years. That's over the board, across the board. And for some of our professions, especially if you think about paramedics, just by way of example, whose profession and practice has changed quite a lot, we want to make sure that the standards reflect what is actually happening with practice and what education providers are able to meet at the moment. Next, please. So here are the new, so some of the areas where we have updated the generic standards. So EDI, safeguarding, fitness to practice and mental health, technology and digital skills, leadership, and then the centrality of the service user. So we're not going to go into all of these in detail in this webinar. There was a webinar previously on EDI. Has there been one already? Sorry.
Yes, Matt. So we've done.
Okay.
You're quite right. We've actually, what we've done is a series of webinars for registrants. So we've actually taken each one of these 6 areas and we've done a few already, and we're going to publicise those to you at the end. So if any of your registrants want to come along to one of these to actually see specifically what everything's written and the changes that are made, for example, in digital and technology, then that would be really useful. The next one is actually bizarrely tomorrow, which is on service user engagement. So we'll promote those in a bit later. But yes, Matt, we've done some of them, haven't we? Yeah.
Great, thanks. So it's important when you're looking at what we've done here that the changes are often changes in emphasis. So with EDI, what we've done is we've included several new standards. These create new obligations for registrants in terms of the way that they offer services to all of the diverse service users, but also include specific issues like understanding unconscious bias, for example. When you're looking at fitness to practice and mental health, again, registrants have always had to manage their own health in order to remain fit to practice. But what has changed is the way that we're emphasizing that and the way that registrants have obligations to make sure that they're seeking the help they need. And also, to be clear, because we've had, I think, a lot of issues with different professions over a number of years where people think that experiencing one episode of ill health or one episode of poor mental health, for example, means that they're immediately not fit to practice. Tech and digital skills, also a very complicated area. It's something that we were able to emphasize a bit more because of the pandemic and the way that everyone's roles have changed and the reliability of new digital platforms. But with something like tech and digital skills, it cuts across many of our other standards. So for example, there's standards relating to confidentiality, where we're asking registrants to be aware of the specific issues that can impact confidentiality using a remote consultation platform. And then with leadership, again, it's always been important for all of our professionals to have autonomy and I think show their leadership skills. What we're trying to emphasize here as well is that the ability to show leadership and to take leadership action isn't just isolated to people who are managing teams or managing units, for example. Next, please. So some important dates, these are also set out on the website, but this is obviously a question people are very keen to fully understand. The important date here is the 1st of September 2023. So that is the point at which the standards are going to become active for all of our registrants on our register. And it is also the point at which new education programs, so where students start their program on or before on or after rather the 1st September 2023, they are going to have a program that is expressly against the new standards. So that means that all of the registrants need to be able to meet the new standards as insofar as they're relevant to their scope of practice. And it means that the education programs are going to be catering to new learners in that way. Just to be 100% clear, everyone who is on an accredited course at the moment, as soon as they graduate, they're going to be eligible to register with HCPC. They have joined an approved course, which leads to registration. They will complete an approved course, which leads to registration. And it's not going to have any sort of negative impact for students which are currently in train. Next, please. So how does the change in the standards of proficiency expect the expectations of the registrants that you manage? So the standards of proficiency obviously cut across the entire practice. They cover all sorts of competencies, but also practices like confidentiality, for example. The way that they change now is to set out more active duty for registrants than we have previously had, for example. So one example that you can find is around safeguarding, where we've made it much more clear that where people have safeguarding concerns, where registrants have safeguarding concerns, it's not just about identifying it, it's about reporting it, it's about following it up. Again, most of your registrants is probably something you're already meeting with your own employer policies, and those of you who work under specific pieces of legislation in different parts of the UK, but it's one of the ways that our standards have changed expectations. And for example, when it comes to ED&I, we have here demonstrate rather than merely understand the standards. So with our EDI standards, our current ones talk about understanding the importance of EDI, whereas our future ones look more at the importance of making things like reasonable adjustments, dealing with unconscious bias, or having specific regard to ways that different protected characteristics intersect with one another. So EDI has always been in our standards, EDI continues to be in our standards, but it talks about a different way that we expect registrants to meet that standard.
Thanks, Matt. That's really gives a real super overview. And what we thought we'd do, there's a couple of questions coming through in chat, Matt, but I'll let you digest them while I'm just having a look at some of the specifics, if that's okay. What we thought it was really useful for you to do. So Matt's talked about the high level reasons why we did it, you know, why we reviewed the standards, what high level aspects, those 6 main parts of the standards of proficiency that he's made the changes in. There's quite a lot of information on our website about those. And there's also a really good document on our website which shows the changes that have been made between the old standards and the current standards. OK, so we thought we'd just show you a few examples, because if you're anything like me, I need something concrete to hang these things on. The wording needs to be fairly concrete for me. So I picked a few to illustrate some of these points, and Matt's already talked about fitness to practice, maintaining, or as registrants, we all have a responsibility to maintain our own physical and mental well-being, our mental health. And we've just beefed some of these up, really, to be honest. So you can see there in the new standards, we've included something specifically about managing the emotional burden that comes with working in a pressurised environment. Never has that been so true for the last few years, but we've actually specifically mentioned that. And I think it's really important that you can remember, you can also think that these standards are really important for you as employers, because they can drive change. If your registrants are saying, actually, I don't feel that I've got enough time or enough support or enough facilities to manage this emotional burden, then actually it can help you put the case to management to actually hopefully make some of these changes. So we're hoping it might be also a driver for change for you. So you can see there that classically that's where it's actually a change has been made. Leading on from that one, particularly with the wellbeing strategies and maintaining our own fitness to practice, we used to say that it was really important to maintain our own fitness to practice as registrants, but now we've actually included something about thinking about wellbeing strategies again, in order using those wellbeing strategies in order to maintain our own fitness to practice. And I think what the nice thing about this does, it links quite clearly with our health and character guidance. And Matt, this is another sort of passion of yours, isn't it, really? You were very instrumental in writing the new, not new now, actually, probably a year and a half ago, health and character guidance. And I particularly pulled from that, Matt, this really good flowchart, because I'm a bit of a flowchart person. I've added the red arrows at the side because I think they're really important for registrants who have concerns about maybe their own health and well-being, mental and physical health and well-being to be thinking about. Is that right? Is that why you designed that flowchart, Matt?
Yeah. So we've historically, as an organization, noted that there are certain professions that over refer themselves for health conditions, especially mental health conditions, usually because of employer pressure and probably because of insurance pressure. There's a whole bunch of other external pressures. But what we want to be clear about is that we expect people to make health declarations only where that health condition impacts on their ability to practice safely and effectively. So if you're looking at that flow chart, if you are an employer and you're wondering whether or not you want to recommend your employee makes a referral for themselves, you need to wonder, is this something that the employer is going to be able to manage? So is it something they can manage through medication, through treatment, through adaptations at work, for example? If it's not something they can manage with medication or treatment, for example, then you look at adapting or limiting or changing a scope of practice. So, for example, this is something that often happens with students who have got a disability who are going through their education program. Their practice placement might have special adaptations to them to enable them to meet their standards of proficiency while being able to accommodate their disability. And that means they have been able to practice safely and effectively, and that is how their role is defined. It doesn't mean that they're not able to practice safely and effectively. And actually, I've jumped ahead of myself there because that's the other one, which is about reasonable adjustments. So I think the most important thing is here is if a registrant is really, really not sure whether or not they need to make a health and character or health declaration, if they're unsure whether or not their fitness to practice is impaired, then they can speak to the HCPC or they can make a referral. If there's nothing to be referred, there's also no problem there. But where if there are adaptations, if there's a way to limit scope of practice, if there's treatment, if a condition is managed, then there's not really a reason for you to make a health declaration. So even if you've got a long-term illness, one of the examples that we've got in the web guidance talks about someone who's got a long-term illness, and if it's a managed long-term illness, it would only become a problem once they've had some sort of change in their health, which would make it difficult for them to actually meet their standards. And so that's something we want people to think about, especially with mental health, is that having an episode of depression, for example, these are all just obviously examples, is not something you necessarily need to immediately refer the HCPC for. We want people who are having trouble with their mental health to seek assistance from their employers and not be afraid that seeking that assistance means that they are going to have to then be referred to FTP. It's really not the point.
Thanks, Matt. And we will actually cover this again in a little bit more depth in our second webinar, looking at registration, because there are points when you can self-refer or you can let the HCPC know if you've got concerns, and we'll talk a lot more about that in the next one. There's a couple of questions coming up, Matt. Did you have a chance to have a read of them? It's radiographers performing standard MRI procedures, standard, you know it off by heart, so standard 13.36. What was your answer to that, Matt?
So I'll put it in the chat as well. But so first of all,
you.
just a disclaimer is that obviously everyone's scope of practice is slightly different, and it's determined by your role and your working conditions and all the rest of it. But where you are not doing anything related to MRI, for example, that's not going to fall within your scope of practice. And so when you're meeting the standards, you meet the standards insofar as they're relevant to your scope of practice. So you wouldn't have to meet that MRI. You wouldn't have to be able to do MRI in order to meet that. If you were ever required to do that as part of your job, it would be something you would upskill yourself through something like CPD, or you wouldn't do it because it wouldn't be in your scope. So the standards obviously apply to people in all different roles. There's lots of people who are in very senior management roles with very little service user interaction, but they're able to meet the standards by meeting the standards that are relevant to them still.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. And there's a really good question from Claire. Congratulations, her daughter's just started her speech and language course, which is very exciting. And she's concerned because, well, she's not concerned, but she's just saying that it's interesting that the new standards will come into effect halfway through the programme. And that's not actually the case, is it, Matt? It applies to new standards, new courses, doesn't it, starting next year? That's right, isn't it?
Yes, so new ones will have to do it, but some of the education providers are already going to be meeting these standards. So the course that, sorry, did they say their daughter is on, might already be meeting our standards relating to EDI. It's when we set the standards, we spoke to education providers about what they'd be able to do. So often a lot of these changes are already at threshold for education providers.
Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to go on with a little bit more content and then we'll come back to the chat if that's all right. I know that Patrick will keep an eye on some of the chat questions and I know that you'll have a quick look at them, Matt, while I'm chatting. Is that okay? So we've given a couple of examples, particularly related to fitness to practice, and I thought I'd give you another example related to technology and digital, really. We already had quite strong guidance about confidentiality across all our standards of conduct, performance and ethics and our standards of proficiency. But really what we've done in our new standards of proficiency, we've specifically highlighted that confidentiality and consent and informed consent really extend to other mediums. And we've taken into account, given a couple of examples, things like clinical notes that are including photography, video and audio recordings and digital platforms, really. So just making people mindful that confidentiality is not just related to a patient's notes, it's related to lots of things that can go into a patient's notes. So we thought that's actually really, really important. And I should say some of these examples are from a variety of, I've used a variety of professionals just to have a little bit of a difference, and I've interrogated different professional groups having different standards of proficiency changes. So they're slight nuances. There are some generic ones that apply to all, but there's some slight nuances depending which professional group you're actually in. So another example is safeguarding, which Matt's already mentioned. We really strengthened the safeguarding wording and made it a lot more overt within our standards of proficiency because we think that's really, really important. And thinking about, safeguarding processes, that's really, really super useful. And my colleague Fiona recently did a webinar on safeguarding for registrants and the new standards of proficiency and what it actually has said. Confidentiality, again, looking at disclosure. So highlight, we didn't in the old standards proficiency or the current standards have the word disclosure. We talked about confidentiality, but we didn't highlight when disclosure might be actually necessary. So we've included that in the new standards of proficiency. And Matt already mentioned this one under equality, diversity and inclusion, which is exactly right. Several things have changed within the new standards of proficiency, and this is just one example. And all I'm doing is giving you a little bit of a flavour of some of the things that have changed because we thought that might actually be useful. And Matt already mentioned that we specifically mentioned unconscious bias in our standards. So what do we expect of your registrants, the people that you manage or the people that you work for? Well, we expect them obviously to reflect on the new standards of proficiency and sort of think about assessing themselves against those new standards. So one way of thinking about it is for them to undertake something called a gap analysis, to think about where they are now, where the new standards are and what the difference is and what areas they might need to do, for example, some more training on, or they might need to do some more reflections or some more learning on. And they use that really to generate discussion and to inform their CPD and learning needs. And this is what your registrants should be thinking about. This is the thing we're telling them to do at every webinar that we hold for them, because they might be really worried, because they might be worried that they're going into a renewal process. And again, we will talk about renewal and registrations in our next webinar, and being selected for an audit. And again, we'll be talking about that in the next webinar. When we look at registration. But I know that's something that's quite high on the agenda of all registrants. They tend to worry, and I worry myself about doing, as a nurse, I have to revalidate every 3 years. But registrants, when they have to renew every 2 years, that's certainly something that concerns them, that they might get chosen for an audit. So while we are on the audit and the renewal conversation, I just thought it was really useful to remind everybody that at the moment, the professions that are currently in renewal, in our renewal cycle, are operating department practitioners, and the ones that are coming next are practitioner psychologists. So just to keep an eye out for those renewal dates, and again, we'll talk a lot more about those in our next webinar. So this is the gap analysis that we thought we'd suggest that you could give to your staff to do. This is something that you could do, and my colleague Patrick will kindly put in chat the link to a reflective template for a gap analysis that you could actually give out to your staff and get them to complete. So the one we've devised is, we thought it might be useful to you to actually give them something to actually do. So the first thing you could ask them to do is to review the new standards of proficiency and think about the changes that have been made and sort of summarise some of those changes for themselves. Really, it enables them to think themselves, what are the changes that have been made for their specific standards of proficiency? And the next step for them is to think about, well, how are they doing related to those changes in the standards of proficiency? Do they exceed in them? Can they reflect on a situation that illustrates where they exceeded on them? They might already be really well integrating the equality, diversity and inclusion standards of proficiency within their work, or service user engagement within their work, and they can reflect on it. It's really nice for you then to use this gap analysis during your conversations, maybe during your appraisal or performance development conversations, to actually get them to actually do a gap analysis before that, to actually talk through with you what their learning needs might be. And also to celebrate things that we do well, because one of the things we're not very good at as registrants is celebrating what we do well. So that might be quite useful. Excuse me. Then can they identify any learning and development needs related to the new standards of proficiency? And again, this will help with their appraisal, will help inform their personal development plans, and hopefully this will be really useful to them. So gap analysis is one thing that you can do. So what are your responsibilities as an employer? Well, you need to be fairly comfortable with them yourself. Now, if you manage many professional groups, that's going to be quite difficult for you to be comfortable with all the standards of proficiency, which is, you know, more difficult. If you're a physiotherapist who manages 10 physiotherapists, that's fairly easy because you'll be well aware of your own standards of proficiency. So be comfortable with them if you can, but remind them to read them. So some registrants might not have realised that the new standards of proficiency have been changed, but it's useful to remind them. So look for resources from professional bodies. Professional bodies have the most amazing resources, and I know that we've been communicating with them a lot, and Matt was communicating with them a lot when he was writing the new standards of proficiency, but they're all writing resources that are useful for their registrants. Start a conversation at your team meeting, have it as an agenda item, the new HCPC standards of proficiency. What do you know about them? And get one of your staff members to share the changes. That would be even better. And ask them to complete a gap analysis. Okay, so that might be actually quite useful to you as a way of finding out where they are. Review job descriptions, because sometimes job descriptions, for example, technology and digital. My colleague was talking to a registrant the other day who was saying that sometimes job descriptions are a little bit out of date, and they might talk about old technology, for example, fax machines or things like that. So think about thinking about updating job descriptions, and come to our other webinars where we'll talk a lot more about things like the new standards of proficiency and registration. Now, Patrick, are there any other questions coming up that we need to answer before I move on to the next part? Because I find it difficult to look at chat as well as speak.
Yeah, there's a question here from Emma. It's quite long, so I'll bear with me. So how does the HCPC support registrants who are in traditional roles in statutory services where other disciplines continually put registrants under pressure to work outside their scope of practice? And JD to fill nursing gaps. Oh yeah, and the job description, sorry, to fill nursing gaps. They've now tried to rebrand these tasks as team roles, but they are not. Oh, sorry, has Matt answered that one?
Matt's putting his hand up, so I think he's going to answer this.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Yeah, I've written something in the chat there.
Oh, sorry. Yeah.
No worries. I mean, I'm sure it's a question more than one person has. This is, yeah, we receive concerns like this. We obviously don't regulate employers, so the ability that we've got to influence employers is fairly minimal. We expect employers to ensure that they are creating an environment where their registrants are able to meet all of their HCPC standards. Where you are feeling that you are not working within your scope of practice, it's important that you are able to take a step back and not perform those tasks. It places you and your employer at risk. I think it's something you must raise with your employer as soon as possible. I know that that's easier said than done, and there are other options you should probably think about. So I put in there people like if you're based in a country that has freedom to speak up guardians, a country of the UK that has freedom to speak up guardians, it's important to raise. But it is important to raise with your employer as soon as possible that working outside of your scope of practice is not a small thing or something that you should be stretching and flexing as workforce needs require. It's a very real requirement that you need to be able to meet at all times, and it's critically important for patient safety.
Thanks ever so much, Matt. Yes, I totally agree. Anything else, Patrick, that's coming up that we can answer before we move on?
No, I think we've got everything. I just want to say sorry. There was the I put the template for the gap analysis with the typo. It's now been corrected, so it should work now.
That's perfect. Thank you very much. Brilliant. So that's your responsibilities as employers. I'm sorry it's quite a long list, but I think that some of those things you can delegate from yourself to somebody in your team. So, you know, to get somebody in your team to actually do a presentation at one of your team meetings about the new standards of proficiency and what it means for them, to distribute our gap analysis form and get them all to complete it at a team meeting, and then, you know, have a look at where are the gaps for the team, would be really, really useful. So I'm hoping that some of these things will be useful for you as employers. And we've put in some words in chat also for you to publicise our registrant webinars that might be useful as well, that you can actually add to newsletters and things like that as well. So other resources that are useful to you, well, I'm going to plug the newsletter again, I'm afraid, because it is so useful to you as employers. So if you haven't already, please sign up for the newsletter. That would be really useful. I should say this session is also recorded. Somebody reminded me in chat to mention that just now. What happens is at the end of all the webinars, we'll put them onto the HCPC YouTube channel just as a resource for people to look at if they haven't had a chance to come to the webinars before. Some of you, lots of you, will have students out with you in practice. How wonderful is that? And thank you again for the support that you're providing them, because, you know, unless we have students of the future, it's going to be really hard, isn't it? So we have a fantastic student hub. So if they haven't accessed it, or again, if you want to give them that when you see them, ask them to have a look at our student hub, because there's some really useful things that are in that. So I'm going to go to our polling now. This is where I'm hoping it's going to work again, which will be really nice. But at the end of the session now, how do you now rate your understanding of the new standards of proficiency as employers? I'm going to ask you, if you don't mind responding to this now, it'd be really useful. So what we've done in this session is we've just given a very brief overview of what the Health and Care Professionals Council does, a little bit about the background to why the new standards of proficiency were reviewed and where we are in our reviewing cycle of standards. We've talked about some practical examples, really, some sort of actual concrete examples of the standards of proficiency, and we've answered some of the questions that are, you know, worrying you as employers. And hopefully we've also signposted you to things that might be useful to you as well. So that's quite useful as well. Brilliant. Thanks ever so much. I'm just going to give this a few more seconds and then I'm going to come off. It seems that we have increased it a little bit, which is great. We were never going to go up to 10 probably, although somebody's kindly put 10 in chat, but we've done it as much as we can. It's reading your new standard of proficiency. How long would you think that they would take if you were an operating department assistant and practitioner and you wanted to read your new standard of proficiency? I would say about 20 minutes to actually think about them and read them. Matt, would you? Put you on the spot.
I was typing and not listening. What were you saying, sorry?
How long do you think it would take you to read the new standard of proficiency for a profession? I said about 20 minutes maximum, really. Yeah,
it's relatively straightforward. And they're all grouped quite thematically and easy to read. So
yeah, it shouldn't be too bad to read, should it? Thanks ever so much for that. Brilliant. So these are the other two events for you specifically as employers. As I said, the next one, we've touched a little bit upon registration, but we were looking a lot more at registration and renewal and audit and things that might concern you as an employer, making sure that your registrants maintain their registration and how you can, that's my responsibility as a registrant, I should say, but it's about how you can help your registrants on that journey. So they're quite useful. And what else will we be doing at the Health and Care Professionals Council? Well, just a couple of things that are on our website thought might be useful to you, just to let you know what's happening, really. If you are a UK student and somebody mentioned that one of their daughter was on a UK speech and language course, when she comes to the end of the course, she'll be asked to apply for registration at the Health and Care Professionals Council. Well, that's now an online process, which is really exciting, along with our international applications, which are also online processes, which makes things so much better for new registrants getting onto our register, much more streamlined. We now collect equality, diversity and inclusion data when you renew your registration, or your registrants renew their registration, and that's really enabling us to play a real vital part in addressing issues of fairness and discrimination, because that's something we want to find out about. There's a statement there on the extension of the COVID-19 temporary register, and again I'm going to publicise that series of webinars for your new staff. And those are them. So tomorrow we've got service user engagement, the 2nd of November we've got one on duty of candour, and the 8th of November we've got one on supervision. So I'm hoping they're going to be really useful for your registrants. You're welcome to come along as well, but hopefully they will be really useful. So we've also launched last week our HCPC consultation on the changes to fees. So if you'd like to be involved in that, that would be fantastic. And Patrick will kindly put the link to our consultation document, but also the link to webinars where you can come along and join in the conversation about that. So that would be useful to you as well. And this is what we've covered today. And I'm going to go to my evaluation form while I'm going to ask Patrick, is there any other questions? So it will be super useful because on the evaluation form, if you can write, if you think there's something we haven't covered that you'd like us to cover in our series, we're very happy to adapt and flex the content. So if a lot of people say you haven't covered this, we will definitely cover it in your next two of the employer series of webinars. So that would be quite useful as well. So Patrick, any questions while people are doing that evaluation? If you literally put your phone up to the screen for the QR code or hit the link, that would be really useful. Are there any questions coming up that we can answer or help with, Patrick?
No, I think Matt's got most of them in the chat, to be honest. Oh, yeah. Yep, I'll put the link in the chat for the survey as well. Thank you.
Yeah, the survey literally takes 3 minutes. One of the first questions is actually asking you where you practice, if you don't mind. It's really useful for us, again, to find out where people are practicing, because we're finding out where we're not reaching people, and that's really important. Somebody said, Natalie said, will we be covering international registration? Ah, that's interesting. We can. Thank you for that. We can definitely cover the process for international registration. That's something we thought about including, but we will definitely include that. Thanks for your thoughts, Natalie. We'll definitely include that in the next registration webinar. So I'm looking up and down to see if there's any questions that are coming up, but I don't think they are. Any other comments anybody's got? Don't think so. Hopefully people are just doing our evaluation survey. That's the most important thing. And I want to finish with a really big thank you. Thank you for giving up the last 3/4 of an hour of your lunch or your time of your day. We hope to see you at our next webinar, which is quite exciting, which is about registration, as we said. And let me know on the evaluation form if there's things that we haven't covered that you want us to cover. We are here to respond to your needs and hopefully, you know, make things useful for you. This is how you contact us. We have put our link to our professional liaison service in chat, but if I'm part of the professional liaison service, and if you want to speak to us or ask us to do any sessions at an AHP event, we're very, very happy to come along in person and actually do that for you. It would be really nice. And also a big thank you for your time and energy. And I think there's just one question coming up. Oh, Matt, I'm looking for a job as a biomedical scientist, and how does the new standards help? If you're looking for a job, the new standards of proficiency would be really good to look at, because sometimes they would ask you in the interview about the new standards of proficiency, maybe if you've read them, maybe if you know about them, but also sometimes they ask competency questions. Most of the time they ask competency questions for interviews, and some of them are based around those standards. So they're really, really useful, not just in sort of what you do, but actually useful for those things as well. And somebody's asking if we provide a compulsory mandatory training online for safeguarding issues and other issues. We don't at the HCPC. Your employer will, if it's applicable to you, will provide mandatory training on safeguarding. There is also e-learning for health, amazing resource that has the most amazing variety of e-learning courses that you can do. And I know they have good ones on safeguarding that I've just had to do, so hope they're quite useful as well. Anyway, thank you very much for your time, and really enjoyed getting to know you and hearing about some of your concerns. I hope that you found that useful. Thank you very much to my colleagues, Fiona and Patrick in the background, and Matt, who's been an utter star as usual, answering all the difficult questions. Thanks ever so much. Nice to meet you, everybody. Do take care. Do leave and enjoy the rest of your day. We'll just stay on. I'll just stay online for a few more minutes with Matt, just to see if there's any more questions coming on. If there are, please ask them, and we're very happy to take them. But if there's not, then we will go as well eventually. All right. We'll just stay on here for a few more minutes. Don't think there's any coming on. No, lovely. Take care, everybody. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.